The night shift, the room that didn't exist. The first thing I learned about working the night shift was never to trust the sounds you hear. The sound of pipes clicking as they contract in the cold. The sound of metal sheets trembling in the wind. The sound of footsteps coming from far away, only to disappear when they get close. But there was another rule too. A rule no one had ever told me directly. If the red telephone rang at 3:13 a.m., don't answer it.
That night, I had only been working at Arman Metals for 2 weeks. The factory stood outside the city, a huge complex with 3 warehouses, an administrative building, a raw material storage area, and an old building that had been abandoned for years. People called it the Old Archives. Its windows were covered with wooden boards, black stains of dampness spread across its walls, and the entrance was always secured with a chain. It didn't even exist on the company's updated map. My shift ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. The previous guard was a man named Rahimi. Before leaving, he gave me only a few instructions. Patrol the grounds every 2 hours. If you hear anything coming from the old building, ignore it. Then, just as he was walking out, he turned around and said, "If the red telephone rings, don't answer it." I laughed and said, "The red telephone? Everything here is digital." Rahimi looked toward the corner of the room. There, behind a metal cabinet, sat an old telephone, a dusty red telephone with no wire attached to it. He said, "That one." Then he left. That night, nothing happened until 1:47 a.m. A light rain was falling, and the images from the security cameras trembled in the blue glow of the monitors. To keep myself awake, I made some tea and turned the radio on at low volume. At 1:47, camera 8 went out. Camera 8 showed the narrow corridor behind the old building, a place no one was allowed to enter. At first, I thought it was a technical problem. I switched the feed off and on several times, but the screen showed nothing except static. Then, between the waves of static, something appeared. A corridor, dark and narrow. It looked like the corridor inside the old building, but not exactly. In the image, lights were glowing along the ceiling, even though the building had been without electricity for years. At the far end of the corridor stood a woman. She was wearing a long white dress. Her face was hidden beneath long, wet black hair. I thought maybe one of the employees had entered the property. I picked up the radio. "Control to patrol. Is anyone inside the old building?" Only static answered me. I looked back at the monitor. The woman was still standing in the same place. But now, she was one step closer. It wasn't that she had walked. The distance between her and the camera had simply become shorter. I grabbed my flashlight. I tried to convince myself that it was only a problem with the camera feed. If someone really was inside the building, I had to check. The door hadn't been locked from the inside. The chain was hanging around it, but the padlock was missing. That was when I realized something was wrong. I didn't touch the chain. I only stood near the door. From inside the building came the sound of crying. A woman's voice, quiet and muffled, as if someone were calling for help from behind several walls. "Help," the voice came again. "Please, open the door." Then another voice joined it, an old man's voice. "Guard." I didn't answer. The old man's voice continued. "Guard, we're trapped in here." At that exact moment, my radio switched on. Rahimi's voice came through it. "Don't turn around." I froze. His voice was perfectly clear, but Rahimi didn't work there anymore. A few seconds later, his voice came through again. "Whatever calls your name, don't answer." Then I heard a third voice over the radio. My own voice. But I opened the door. I instinctively looked at my hand. It wasn't on the doorknob. Slowly, I walked back toward the security room. The door of the old building didn't close behind me. The crying continued, but now I could hear footsteps mixed in with it. One step. A pause. One step. A pause. It sounded as if someone with wet, bare feet was walking across the concrete floor. When I reached the security room, I locked the door and checked all the cameras. Camera 8 was working again. The corridor was empty. But then I noticed something. On the floor, there were footprints. The footprints began at the far end of the corridor and continued all the way to the camera. Bare feet. Small feet. The final footprint ended directly in front of the lens. Then I noticed something else. In the corner of the image, I could see the reflection of the glass. And in that reflection, a woman was standing behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't even blink. I stared at the reflection. The woman moved closer. Her hair still covered her face. Water dripped from the ends of it, but the drops disappeared before they reached the floor. Her lips moved in the reflection. Her voice came through the camera's speaker. "I'm still waiting." The lights in the security room suddenly went out. The monitors remained on. In the darkness, only the pale light from the screens fell across my face. Then, the red telephone rang. Once. The sound echoed through the room and stopped. It rang again. This time, it lasted longer. I stared at it. The telephone had no wire. It wasn't even connected to an outlet. When it rang for the third time, the camera feeds changed. All the images disappeared, except for camera 8. The corridor was no longer empty. The woman was standing directly in front of the camera. She moved her hair aside. She had no face. In place of her face was a smooth white surface, without eyes, without a nose, without a mouth. But her voice came from the red telephone. "If you don't answer, I'll have to come to you myself." The phone went silent. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then the sound of knocking came from the old building. 1 knock, 2 knocks, 3 knocks. Then the door of the security room began to move, not from knocking. Someone outside was slowly pressing down on the handle. I looked at the camera showing the area behind the door. No one was there. But on the screen, the handle lowered, then rose again. It lowered once more slowly this time.
A voice came from behind the door. "Open up. It's me." It was my voice. Exactly my voice. "I'm outside. You're trapped in there." I stepped backward. The voice continued. "Rahimi told you not to answer, but he never said you couldn't answer yourself." Then I heard the red telephone. Not from the desk, from behind me. The red telephone stood in the dark corner of the room, but it was no longer sitting on the floor. The faceless woman was holding it. She was standing so close that I could see cold water dripping from her dress onto the floor. I didn't scream. My body no longer obeyed me. The woman raised the receiver and held it to her ear. From inside the phone came the sound of a crying child. "Mommy, why did you leave me here?" The woman slowly turned her head toward me. This time, I heard Rahimi's voice. "I finally found you." The woman took one step forward. The room became smaller. The walls seemed to move closer together. The light from the monitors stretched across the room, and the images on the screens began to shake. The digital clock on the wall read 3:13, but the second hand wasn't moving. The woman raised her hand and pointed toward the guard's chair. I sat down, not by choice. Something invisible pulled my body backward. The woman stood behind me. Her wet hair fell over my shoulder. Then the unseen mouth beneath it opened beside my ear. "Every guard has to hand over his post." Suddenly, every sound stopped. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, the sky outside was beginning to brighten. It was 6:05 a.m. The door of the security room was open. The grounds looked peaceful. Rahimi was standing near the entrance. When he saw me, he let out a breath of relief and said, "I thought we'd lost you again tonight." I said, "Again?" His expression changed. He said, "You've been sitting here since last night." I looked at the monitors. The camera feeds were normal. The old building was dark and abandoned. There was no woman. There were no footprints. Rahimi stepped closer and placed his hand on my shoulder. "You shouldn't come back here." I asked him, "Has anyone disappeared here before me?" Rahimi didn't answer. He only looked at the wall behind me. I turned around too. Beneath the pale morning light, a shadow was cast across the wall. My shadow. But I was standing. The shadow was sitting in the guard's chair. Its back was turned toward the camera. One hand rested on the red telephone. Rahimi whispered, "That's the one who answers the phone every night." I asked, "Then what am I?" Rahimi stared at my face. The color drained from his skin. He said, "You?" His voice trembled. "You disappeared 3 weeks ago."
I looked at the red telephone. It began to ring. At that exact moment, a woman's voice came from inside the room. "Guard, the next shift has arrived." Rahimi ran toward the door. I tried to follow him, but my legs wouldn't move. Something inside me already knew I didn't need to run. Because now, I was the guard there. And every night, at 3:13 a.m., the telephone rang. Every night, someone spoke from the other end.
Sometimes it was Rahimi's voice. Sometimes it was a woman's. And sometimes it was the voice of a man sobbing as he said, "I'm still inside the room." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that every time the telephone rang, my shadow rose from the wall, walked toward the phone, and answered in my voice. "Don't worry. No one is trapped here." Then it paused and quietly added, "Not yet."